Oh, Matthias is here. Oh. Yeah, I'll do it.
Oh, I thought Matthias was. Yeah,
Hi,
sorry
everyone.
for not emailing Matthias. I forgot how pings work.
We're live.
Hi, everyone. This is the June 26th meeting of the IPython dev team, and we switched by an hour because World Cup, I think. But we'll have a regular meeting. I think we have a fairly loaded agenda, so let's get going.
So, agenda item 1, loading NB extension on widget instantiation. Brian, you wanted to talk more about this.
Yeah, so currently there's two steps in getting a widget to work in the front end. One is that you have to publish JavaScript that has the widget view code, and that has to be registered with the widget manager for that particular widget. And then when the widget is instantiated, the widget manager looks at the view name and calls that logic that was previously registered with it. And that causes some problems because all of it's asynchronous now with require, and so you sort of have to publish the code that registers the widget, wait a little bit, and then you can instantiate widgets. It's sort of just clunky. And the idea is to have all widgets declare a required JS location of the widget declaration code, and then the widget manager will take care of loading that the first time that type of widget is instantiated. And the main topic I wanted to bring up is the security aspects of this. And the issue is that the code that registers JavaScript widgets has to be run in the global page context, because that's what.
Can I just interrupt and say here, the model we're thinking of is that we entirely get rid of the registration step, so that instead of specifying a name, you specify a module and a name of something exported from that module.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and but that JavaScript code that defines the widget has to be run in the global page context, because that's where the widget manager is. And this basically means that someone can subclass a widget in Python, specify the location of JavaScript, and that JavaScript will be run on the global page context. And putting output in iframes or even widgets in iframes doesn't help. Like it basically means that there's a path that would allow someone to run JavaScript in the global page context outside of all the secure iframes.
No, wait a second. If widgets are in iframes, right?
Yes.
If widgets are in iframes, wouldn't the widget load happen in the iframe?
No, I mean, we don't know how to do widgets in iframes yet because
we don't know how to do anything in iframes yet.
Well, especially because the models for a single widget instance are shared between different cells.
Right.
And so we truly don't know how to do widgets yet in iframes, and I don't want to pretend like we do. Mm-hmm. But I don't want us to make core widget design decisions that will make it more difficult for us to put widgets in iframes. That's
but
basically.
I think, if anything, I don't think this does make it more difficult. I think, if anything, it makes it easier because you don't have a global object that you have to register widget classes with.
Yeah, there is no global widget registry.
Yeah, and the
so if anything, this makes it easier.
So here's a question: what part of the code becomes responsible for constructing the widget instance then, using the code defined by the module? It's still the widget manager, right? And the widget manager is the one that needs access to that JavaScript code.
Yeah, but it at the very least, so there is no global registry of widget. So right now there's a mapping of like widget name to widget constructor.
Yep.
That would no longer exist.
So it would every time the widget manager wants to create a widget,
It would be a require call.
it's a require call. It grabs that and instantiates it on the spot.
Yeah.
I mean, this is analogous to how we specify classes and things in the Python API, is that we specify a full import path or something.
Yeah. No, I actually much prefer this design. I'm just trying to make sure there's no.
I think there's two problems with putting widgets in iframes. One is that the widget manager has to keep this registry or this mapping of name to constructor, and the other is the model stuff. And this doesn't change anything about the model stuff the registry of instances, but it does actually remove the problem of maintaining the mapping of key to constructor.
So isn't there a bigger problem though that the widget manager or com manager or whatever needs to have a mapping of com IDs to widget objects so that when it gets a com message it can pass it to the relevant widget.
Yeah.
And if those are in iframes, it can't interact with them, can it? I don't know how the iframes thing works.
You can send iframes have even a sandbox iframe. You can do things. You can send messages.
Yes.
Oh, I see.
So we could have them communicate with messages that we control.
I see.
I guess
basically, I think this require change. The relevant point here is I don't think it makes anything worse in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my main.
And if anything, it makes it ever so slightly better.
Okay.
Probably not more than. Probably a negligible amount better in terms of that respect. It makes it better in other ways, but
yeah, I'm fine as long as it doesn't make it worse.
Yeah, I don't think it does.
Okay, great. But I think it's a huge improvement, and otherwise, let's go forward with it.
Great.
Good.
Okay, documentation.
Let's take some notes on the doc. Is someone taking notes there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. My computer, basically Hangouts pretty much makes my computer, sends it back about 2 decades in time in terms of responsiveness. So,
yeah, I'm running on a separate device to avoid that.
Okay. Documentation.
So this was just prompted by Thomas had some doc changes that he wanted merged in, and then I decided to get all philosophical with like, what are we actually doing again, and can we can we circle back and try to figure that out? So this was just a way of trying to capture our discussion about that.
Okay.
I think we've done a lot of talking, and the point that we sort of concluded is that whenever we talk about documentation, we sort of talk about it extensively about all the good, sort of all the pros and the cons of the different approaches that we could take. Mm-hmm. And we never make a decision, or sort of we never prioritize like what are the things that we actually prefer to do. And so maybe this was just a way of getting this on our agenda to try to think about like what do we what do we want our documentation to be, or what should we prioritize for, and also just a way of capturing some of the things that are the goods and the bad. So I wrote down some of the things that sort of came up right away, Good. But there's probably more that need to be expanded upon. But as a way of like not having the whole discussion every time, sort of, and we don't need to have the discussion right now. I think this is more of a point of I mean maybe if there are new points to be added to this, that'd be great. But outside of that, it's sort of like a place to capture what the different approaches might be for docs and things like that.
You know, I mean, this is great, and your characterization of the situation is totally right. I know Brian has also been putting a lot of thinking into it and trying to gradually make a little bit of progress. But it is true that we've never. Documentation is a bit of an intimidating problem because it's kind of this giant mountain that we feel we have to climb over the whole thing, right? And it's very hard to engage, especially given that we have other pretty burning priorities and all things considered, relatively limited bandwidth to do everything with our team. So I feel that it's one of those topics that every time we try, we circle around a little bit, and then we fall back into inactivity due to the size of the problem makes it very hard to tackle. And but I love having this. I think ultimately we should probably put this somewhere on the wiki as a semi-permanent reference of kind of the state of the problem of documentation, and as it evolves, it may gradually morph into concrete tasks on which we can. Basically, this could morph into both ideas and a concrete plan of actual action and things that can be done. I want to hear, since it seems like a lot of the conversation happened between the three of you, do Min and Thomas feel that this little summary captures all the points that you guys went around on, or is there anything else that's missing there? So that at least we're starting from a good summary, because next I'd like to hear from Brian, who's been thinking a lot about this lately, to see what you see in this piece. But first, I'd like to know if the three of you feel that it's kind of a reasonable first iteration of your conversations, so that the rest of us know if you all.
We didn't actually converse that much on all of the stuff that's noted. It grew out of a discussion about how we're building API docs and how we can have a little bit more manual control of, certain things should be imported and used from a place which isn't where they're defined, and how we can show that properly in the docs.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it grew out of. Let me link the PR. Yeah, it's kind of a question. Where it came from was dealing with the AutoGen API docs.
Mm-hmm.
Which are problematic.
Super old and super clunky.
Well, yeah.
Well, I've done some work to.
You have? Okay. I
to
didn't know
update them. They're not.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing, because what we do right now, and the kind of basic state is you just run over all the modules and then auto module everything, and it documents everything where it's defined.
Right. But that's not where people are looking at using it.
Yeah, and so there's no indication that we have things like, we have a few API modules like nbformat.current, which is relevant to this, to Thomas's PR.
Or IPython.display is a classic one.
Yeah.
People go searching
those I've actually treated in the PR.
Yeah,
and they find stuff in core.
Yeah, and so the current documentation is actively detrimental to people's understanding of how to use IPython, because it
leads them into the wrong place.
It actually doesn't document the API modules because things aren't defined there, and it does document the private private modules that people should never import.
Yeah.
And so Thomas took a stab at alleviating that, at some tooling to hide this sort of private things and document an API module by using its all list, which I think definitely does improve things. But we went from there to just discussing in general about. So in addition to how do we break it up between Sphinx and notebooks in terms of reference docs and narrative docs, part of the discussion was also things like doc strings generated API docs versus manual API docs, and right, because if you tailor your doc strings to, if you write your doc strings for the purpose of them being informative in the Sphinx API docs, then they are strictly worse than if you were writing them to be read by a human just looking at it. And that's just a general tension of how much do you play nice with the Sphinx API docs in your doc strings, and how much do you how much do you write the doc strings to be looked at kind of as they are. And I tend to lean very strongly toward the doc strings being read by a human unmodified rather than the Sphinx API docs. For instance, I strongly dislike putting crosslinks in doc strings.
Colon whatever backticks for that crosslink. Yeah.
Whereas I'm much more inclined to put those links in.
Yeah, to the point where there was, and what prompted this PR was there's a decorator in NB format that decorates methods in NB convert to ensure that their crosslinks refer successfully to notebook node. Because, and it's related to this API thing, that you can't refer to nbformat.current.notebook node, you have to refer to v3 because that's where it's defined.
Yes.
And so I was about to open a PR to just remove that decorator because I thought it was horrendous and the crosslink was not worth anything. But
Thomas made it work.
Yeah, Thomas made it work.
No, I removed the decorator by documenting the public API module rather than the place that it imports it from.
Yeah, the reason the decorator was needed was that the public API location of notebook node did not exist in Sphinx, so you couldn't refer to it. You had to refer to the current version, like all the way back to its definition. And so Thomas fixed that, so it no longer needed a decorator to update itself. But it still has the reference, which I would prefer it didn't have. But that's I don't know.
Yeah,
so there are at least two tensions in documentation in general. There's good doc strings as read, and there's good doc strings as rendered by API docs, and those are mutually exclusive. There's good doc strings. I mean, there's a tension. Making it better at one makes it worse at the other. It doesn't make it necessarily bad, but it's a
tension. Yeah.
And there's a similar tension between using notebooks for narrative interactive docs and using Sphinx for richly interlinked, cross-linked
documentation.
So I think on the issue of API docs, this is something I've been thinking about a little recently, and part of it is based on my experience in working with other Python libraries that have API docs. And my conclusion at this point is that the goal of API docs is to anger users. and I say that because even when the API docs are beautifully curated and everything works and it's nice, when a user goes there, the user thinks, I found something helpful. The reality is that API docs are never helpful. They never, ever answer the question that the user actually has at the time. And I challenge someone to point me to a situation where they have observed...
Are you talking about API documentation of APIs in general, or generated API docs?
Generated API docs. And the thing that I always find is that let's say I have a matplotlib question. How do I add grid lines, or how do I modify my tick marks in this way? I know by now that if I end up in my Google searches on the matplotlib API docs, the auto-generated ones, I will not be able to discern how to accomplish what I want.
Yeah.
Well, but that's not the sort of question that API docs are there to answer.
But
how do I achieve this result is not what you go to API docs for. You go to API docs for what parameters does this function take, in which case it absolutely answers it.
But that's never people who are using software, the questions that they always have are use case driven. How do I, like, they don't want to know.
I quite regularly want to know what parameters a function takes.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, and an example of this is that in my mind, the best technical documentation on the planet, Mathematica, does not have auto-generated API docs. They have, quote, reference documentation.
They also pay a bunch of people to write their docs.
I know. I know that. But,
yeah,
but my concern is that we just anger users by pretending that this is useful. That's my concern.
Yeah, and it's a question of, and we could put artificial pressure to have good manual reference documentation by removing the API docs, but I'm not sure that pressure would be enough.
Oh, I agree. No, that alone would not be enough.
Yeah, I think what works best is some combination of auto-generation and manual curation. You know, our API is too big to make reference documentation and keep it up to date manually, but doing it purely automatically, just scan all these files and document everything they define, is too much. So the approach I go for is to start from the scanning of files, but have, you know, blacklists and whitelists and things to determine what actually ends up documented.
Yeah, I mean, I think a whitelist approach is. I mean, it depends.
Well, we have a bit of a combination because, yeah. I mean, I don't actually want to try and work out a whitelist of what we consider public API, because I think it would be too big to maintain that whitelist. So there's a blacklist of modules that aren't public API, but then the API modules, the PR adds a way of instead of scanning things that are defined in the module, you do a from module import star, so the module has to define dunder all. So that's acting as a whitelist for.
Yeah, no, I mean I guess that's a way of doing a whitelist. That I think that.
Yeah, it's a mixture of the default state is include everything where it's defined, and then in the cases where we want it to differ, we take a bit of care to turn it into something else.
So I'm just curious, like what projects that you guys know of have API docs that you find useful and you regularly.
NumPy.
NumPy?
Yeah, NumPy. I mean, the NumPy, because NumPy uses the NumPy docstring standard extensively, the NumPy reference docs are pretty good, because those docstrings, they define all the parameters of the function calls, and they even provide little examples, which, for example, the standard Python library ones don't. So I regularly use the NumPy API docs all the time.
Pandas, I would say, because Pandas has a bunch of functions that take, like, 30 parameters.
Yeah, and I think the Matplotlib API docs are pretty good, but it's one of those things where they are good at the expense of their docstrings.
Yes. Yes. So, for example, the Matplotlib is a library where you don't want to read the docstrings in IPython. You really want to go and read the HTML version of those docs after it's been churned through by Sphinx, because they make such extensive use of preprocessing and parameter injection into the docstrings.
Yeah, and I think they have
cross-linking and whatnot. That, my God, I mean, reading those docstrings in IPython is useless. You really, really want to read them in their website. I'm sorry.
One of the things I talked to Carlos about is having a way to display rendered doc strings. So run.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's something that we just should do. It's been one of those we should do it for forever in our at least in my mental to-do list. Sage has done that for ages. If you ask question mark in Sage, what they do is they pop off a little JavaScript overlay that has nicely rendered HTML, including, I think, rendered mathematics, if I remember correctly. Since Sage has so many documents that have logic in them, I'm pretty sure that they even render the math.
I mean, some of those are doable, but I mean, like cross-references clearly can't work, because in order to get a cross-reference, you would need to render you would need to index the entire Sphinx docs.
I wonder actually, because I mean, a lot of cross-references are, this class. I wonder if you could pull that out in a way that when you click on it, it renders the doc string for that class.
We already spoke of that at last dev meeting, or this was one before. It's also a security risk, and it would be nice to. Because render docstring can inject JavaScript and then execute code in the notebook.
But that's not a problem, because it's a result of user action.
Yeah, I mean, you can also have a dunder doc attribute that is actually a property that goes and does anything. I don't think that's.
And also, I think the direction it should go is to move the doc representation using MIME bundles and things like that, so that you can have nice documentation in terminal and in rich front end.
Yes, absolutely.
So one thing that I'd like to think about is take a little bit of a step back on one front, which is that I think some of these problems, I agree with Brian that they're kind of a big topic that we should that we should tackle, right? But that we're not going to tackle as a project, as IPython alone, but rather that it's a topic that I think we need to tackle at a broader level, because honestly, what I really want is not for docstrings to be better. What I really want is for me to be able to type into some kind of query search box a question and have a system that knows that I have installed NumPy, but that I also have pandas, and that I also have matplotlib on my system, and that can find me useful answers and examples and reference material from all of those libraries, right? And that will display them to me in a nice, immediately, right there. When I type my query, I get my table of results, and when I click on them, I get examples and stuff that is readable, that is nicely formatted, that has proper internal cross-linking, and that has, if there are notebooks available, that has notebooks that I can click on and begin playing with my code, right? And that does that in a way that can automatically discover when that is made available by third-party packages, right? So I would like us to start thinking of a way of getting to that future, which means part of this has to be coming up with conventions that effectively, I think we want to think about a protocol for documentation and for declaring, for projects to declare this is where my docs live, and whether that turns out to be environment variables or a table. I'm not exactly sure, and it's certainly not something that we're going to answer in the next 10 minutes, but I would like us sort of to get there as the long-term project. I think that's a good topic for a BOF at SciPy. At least that's a first way of brainstorming with other projects. I also think it's something where we can lead, in the sense that once we have a rough idea of which way to go, we can be the guinea pigs, since we're going to be the ones implementing at least, or the environment where a lot of that is displayed. We can be the guinea pigs, but having a little bit of traction from the other projects, I think, would be very good. And I also agree with Brian that as we go for funding renewal, I think this is really a very, very important problem, and I think a problem that the funders can see the value of. And we will work on just allocating resources, because honestly, part of our problem with this is purely bandwidth. We all care, we all think it's important, but we never have enough bandwidth to really tackle it head on. None of us can make this our full-time job right now, and this should be somebody's full-time job. And it's an interesting problem. I mean, I honestly think it's a really cool problem and very valuable, but we just don't have the bandwidth to find and allocate those resources. As Brian says, as Min said, Mathematica documentation is not that good by accident, right?
Yeah. They put a lot of money and time into it.
Exactly. I mean, they've decided it's an important problem to solve, and they've put the necessary resources into solving it well. And we've decided it's important, but we haven't put those resources, and right now we can't put them because we don't have them, right?
Well, and I think the secondary thing from the difference between us and Mathematica is the Mathematica is one unified system, and as you mentioned, for us, it's like you have explanatory docs and things like that.
Not quite, Paul. It's not quite unified in the sense that Mathematica actually does have a notion of third-party packages. And it does have a notion, I don't remember exactly how it works because it's been years since I've used Mathematica, but they do have a notion of building the help index. When third-party packages are installed, they can rebuild the help index to detect your packages. So if you add your own library that you wrote, and you install it in your own, like your equivalent of .local, lib, Python, whatever, site packages, right? And you do the documentation according to certain conventions, which I don't know what they are, Mathematica can index that information, and when you do a search in the help system, it can find it. So
technically, Sphinx should be able to do the same thing. There's a plugin called InterSphinx.
Yeah, InterSphinx, and that's one thing we need to look at. That's certainly one thing we want to have a look at. But I think we want to rethink it in the context of the notebook and what our bigger picture is. So Paul, you're right in that a lot of Mathematica comes from its very tight internal integration, but they've actually made provisions to allow for third-party packages to show up as part of that environment in a fairly seamless way. And I don't know how well it works today, but I remember last I used Mathematica with externally installed packages, it worked. I mean, it got the job done. Typically, the quality of the in-house docs was better because they had technical curators, whereas the third-party packages might just have like one or two notebooks with some simple examples written by the author, as usual. These were typically academic libraries in physics. But the point is, they had a mechanism for that problem.
Right.
So in terms of action items, do we try to have do we have slots for a BOF, and is anyone willing to take a lead on a BOF on this one? Because the thing is, and that can't be me, I'm already working with Thomas on the Python 3 BOF, and I was volunteered to be the community lead on the Future of NumPy BOF, which is not going to be contentious at all.
Wow.
And so I would really not want
Who
to
threw you under that train?
Leading that. Yeah, my friends love me so much. So
can't you adapt to the Python 3 BOF, because you can say, hey, we should improve Python documentation.
No, I think it's a little orthogonal. Brian, can I throw you under that bus?
Yeah.
Okay.
You just have to make sure that it's not scheduled at the same time as the IPython BOF, the Python 3 BOF, or the Future of NumPy BOF.
Well, that may get me out of it then.
And if that gets you off the hook, so.
I mean, that's something.
Or
as
honestly,
we talk to other people.
No, and honestly, Brian, even if there's a conflict, if you, I mean, obviously not with the one on IPython, but if there's a conflict with one of the other two, and it has to happen, probably making it conflict with the Future of NumPy might be the most orthogonal one to those others.
And we've got
enough people. We need
IPython
to spread
is well represented. We can be at a couple things at a time.
Absolutely,
there are going to be
it's
a million
okay to parallelize. So don't let that get you off the hook too easily.
We'll put someone there.
All right, but if somebody, Paul, I don't know if you could help. Maybe if you're willing to help Brian, since you already.
Definitely, Brian. I'm on board with this.
So if the two of you guys, and I know Brian has a bunch of other things happening regarding NumFocus there, so if Paul, you can give us a hand maybe with the actual logistics, since Thomas and I are pretty deep up to our neck into the Python 3 one in terms of commitment.
Sounds good.
Okay, so Paul can lead on that.
I have to run.
Yeah.
I will be back at like 12:15 if there's anything more that we want to discuss. The John and Min, I guess, also know about the required JS and options discussion there. So I entered those notes, but I think you can have that discussion without me.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Hi, Brian.
See you.
Hi, Brian.
So let's move on to require. We can talk about documentation for a year.
We probably will.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. John, do you want to take this, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can give a little recap so Fernando kind of knows what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So JavaScript doesn't have the idea of keyword arguments at all. Mm-hmm. So usually what you do is you pass around this option stick, and the option stick has whatever additional arguments that aren't required. Yeah, and we found out so in the refactoring using the require.js PR, we can't. There's a lot of places in our code where we're referencing instances globally that are stored in the capital IPython namespace. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that those instances will now be passed down through the constructors of different classes, so that way you don't have any instances in the global namespace. So to do that, originally I added a bunch of positional arguments, and that made a big clutter of, different classes would need up to 8 or 9 instances, and which is really hard to read. So we decided that we would try using keyword arguments to pass these things in. But, and this kind of leads into this discussion, as it turns out, these things really aren't optional. They are required. Mm-hmm. And my first pass at it, which is in the PR, I constructed one options dict, which I just passed around everywhere. So it's basically like passing around a master handle, like a context that had instances or access to every instance that had been constructed. And that's a bad idea, because then you don't know what's going where and what requires what. So after talking to Brian, I decided to try to implement it such that I explicitly define these option dicts every time I construct these items. And so it's just kind of weird that we are using this keyword argument type approach, but we're using it to define things that are required, like that are not optional. And so, Brian.
So let's think about it for a second, really, in terms of it's whether passing something like a. There's several things. There's the notion that they're optional. There's the notion that they're being passed. The syntax allows you to pass them as key value pairs.
Yeah.
And there's the notion that it allows you to bundle things together, right? Because in C, you have the exact same problem. C doesn't have key value arguments. And this is also a common practice, which is to define, typically people will call it parameters or params, and you would define a struct. And because it's a struct, you can slop it around everywhere you want, and it behaves like key value pairs, because you can access fields in a struct or pointer accesses that also syntactically make it feel in C syntax as close as you're going to get to key value pairs as you can. So the question is really, let's try to understand what of those three aspects of this usage is the one that we really want. Do we want the fact that they are organized as a key value store? Is that what we're after? Is it the fact that some of them are optional and some of them can have default values, so that you can pass effectively an incomplete data structure, because you can know, oh, if this field was not filled in, I know what value to put into it, which is the notion of keyword arguments with defaults, right? Or is it the fact that we simply want this to be a single bundle that contains a group of related things that can be passed around and passed, for example, passed up and down a call chain, where you keep sending this thing as a single bundle? So let's try to understand, because there's a danger.
It's a little bit of everything.
I think it's definitely more of the first, though. So I think we just want that key value pair for the most part.
That most of this structure is shared by everything, and then some of it. So like almost everybody wants a handle on events. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants a handle on config. Almost everybody wants a handle on the URLs. Almost everybody wants a handle on the notebook. Some things want to handle on the kernel, some things, so it's, and some things are safely undefined and can have default values, and so it genuinely is all of the above.
Good God. Okay.
For me, the fact that everybody wants to have access to one of these things means that there are problems in the architecture, and that some
that it really should be a global.
No, that things shouldn't require that much knowledge of the structure of the JavaScript.
But there definitely is that problem. Like,
so Matthias, then what's your proposal for every bit of IPython being able to signal events and be triggered by events?
I don't think that's something we should tackle during this PR. I think the PR is made to have require working.
Yeah.
And we should finish that, focus on that, and this is another problem that should be maybe thought once we have the require stuff which is done and the code cleaned.
Yeah, but so we still need to do something with this PR, because with the global namespace gone, handles need to be passed somehow. Because
the global namespace is not totally gone right now, is it?
The instances are not on it.
The instances are filled in at the very end.
I mean,
so IPython.events is not available.
Yeah.
It sounds like basically we've gone from the fact that we had a global namespace with a bunch of stuff in it to the fact that we're trying to get rid of the global namespace, but in reality, we haven't gotten rid of the design of having a lot of global state.
Yes.
So now we still need to pass that global state around.
Yes.
Right? And so the problem with that is an architectural, I agree with Matthias, that is an architectural design question for which there is no fast answer. When you have a lot of global slop floating around, there is no quick way to get rid of it, because typically what happens is everything needs everything, and you have this intermingled mess of code, and there's no quick way, there is no fast way of saying, oh, let's cut in here, right? We had on our Python code in 2009. I wish Brian was here right now, because he was the poor guy who really dove headfirst into that mess, and heroically over a summer basically cleaned up, digging into the main IPython object, which had enormous amounts of coupled state of that nature, and really tore it up into pieces so that we could, for example, move the magics to a separate subsystem, move shell management to a separate subsystem, and that took months of gradual disentangling bit by bit. What I'm hearing, unless I'm really misunderstanding you guys, is really we need to do that work, and that is design work. That is architecture and design work, where we have to look back at what are we implementing, what is the functionality that we need, how is it coupled by all of this global state, and how can we decouple it, and what were the minimal intersection points where things need to be passed around. That doesn't happen in a day, and that's not a syntax issue that can be fixed. We're moving the problem from one place to another, but we're not fixing anything right now. Given that fact, given that we're just moving the problem around, in a sense, what solution we use probably doesn't matter a whole lot, because they're not really solutions. They're temporary band-aids. We're not really fixing the problem with what we're doing here. So I think what we need to do is minimize harm. Just pick the solution that causes the least problems moving forward. But it seems like we need to realize and kind of appreciate the fact that we have a design problem.
Yeah, and part of the thing is we just want this PR to get require.js working without, and have that design change be a separate task. That's part of.
Yes.
We keep ending up in this design discussion, and we don't want to have it right now.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is we can't, because it's bigger than this, and this isn't going to fix it, right? So my option right now is sort of just make the concrete decision that minimizes harm, and honestly, also that's easiest to make from an implementation perspective, because since it isn't the real solution anyway, if it's an incomplete and, in a sense, wrong solution, there's no point in making it be a lot of work, because the real work that we need to invest is somewhere else. The real work is in the architectural decoupling. That's the hard one, and it's actually the interesting one and the fun one. So there's no point in making a very elaborate solution that requires grepping up and down the entire source code to fix a lot of stuff syntactically when it's just moving chairs on the deck of the Titanic. Okay. What we really need to fix is the hole under the bow, right, where the water is gushing in, not rearrange the chairs on the deck.
Okay, so
let's pick the solution that is least impactful and cleanest, and if it's just grouping that piece of global state that needed to go around in one object, that may be the answer. It may also be that the answer is a mix. For example, identify the minimum pieces of global state, maybe the event handler, maybe this and that, and I haven't looked at the code exactly, so I don't know which ones they are. And those minimal ones, glop them together into one key value store that is passed around pretty much everywhere, because effectively we've moved global state around into one thing. And then add a couple of positional things for places where we really realize that, oh, this one really is only used by that piece of the API, so it's okay for that one to add. It's okay to grow 1 or 2 positional parameters here and there if it's occasional. What you were trying to avoid, John, was to grow 20 positional parameters everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know if the answer for those 2 pieces is 2 or 3 here and 5 here, or 0, and they really all need to be passed around. But again, let's be pragmatic and short term right now.
Yeah, my inclination for this PR is to either have one big blob that you pass around, which is really just keeping the global namespace in, but under a different name.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
Or actually just keeping the global namespace as it is and doing that work separately. But since you've already done the removal of our reliance on the global namespace, I might be inclined to do the former of just build the big blob
and pass
it around, and then we can figure out how to clean that up.
That's kind of the approach that we took with a lot of the refactoring of the Python code, was to start adding this parameter called IPython, or called shell, that a lot of stuff took, and we passed it around. And then we began digging into that thing and gradually removed a lot of it. It's still probably...
Yeah, and that's the other thing. I guess that's the other thing that we could do, is give the dumb object that has a handle on everything, give it a name.
Yeah.
Right, it's a...
Oh, definitely give it a name. I thought you guys had come up with one. Definitely give it a name. And don't call it options. I mean, let's try to give it a name that roughly represents what it is that we're trying to encode in there. And then gradually, let's begin thinking about the design question, because the design work is going to be this careful carving pieces out of that into places.
Yeah, I don't know.
I have I'm gonna pull up while you guys continue. I'm gonna pull up an example, because I think I've implemented all these different things that we've talked about. So we just need to pick one. Like, all the commits are there in the tree. It's sad, but I've iterated through it. And
can you do that for the docs as well, John? That'd be great.
Try every approach. Okay, but so do we have a rough agreement from the perspective of the meeting on what to do with this one?
I think.
Because we have a bunch of stuff and not a ton of time left.
Yeah, go ahead, continue.
Okay.
Small
so
PRs?
This is just like cranking through these PRs quickly?
Yeah, because like they are long-standing, they are pretty short, maybe conflicting with John's work, so it's just like we should just decrease the number of open PR by deciding whether or not we want it or not.
All right, well, let's do what we can in 15-20 minutes.
Okay, 59:57. Damien's IPython slide. Fragments are now in a linear flow and include next cells. Matthias, you've been reviewing
yes.
I'm fine trusting Damien on reveal stuff.
That's the same for me.
Is there?
I only have a question. Is this going to break somebody's existing slideshow? I don't use the two-dimensional thing that Reveal has, but I know people do. I kind of dislike that we have a little bit of a reputation of breaking user documents and user space all the time.
Yeah.
I don't want us to grow that reputation any more than necessary. So does
It's
this?
either, I mean, the current behavior is confusing for user, apparently. I mean, I don't think a lot, so it's a matter of either we piss off future user or we piss off former user. So
we value more. If we think we're going to grow, we should be okay with pissing off past users.
Yeah, up to an extent. I mean, I do think that the philosophy that the Linux kernel team has, which is sort of don't break user space, is a philosophy that the first approximation is very wise. It's sort of saying the burden is on the dev team of keeping, at the cost of pain for us, keeping things working for end users, especially when end users have built content. So my only question is, does this break content, right? If people have written they've developed their lesson plan for a course that has hundreds and hundreds of of slides broken into 20 lectures, and they've built a very elaborate plan using the 2D structure, does this completely break their thing, and do they say, oh, well, great, if I update IPython now, half my students can't view my slides and I have to spend a week?
I don't think it has.
Does it do
I don't
that?
think it has much of any effect on existing ones.
Okay, then
It's just adding a notion of fragments.
okay. So, but the reason I'm asking that so it's not removing the ability of reveal slideshows to do the 2D thing. As I said, I don't use that, but it is a feature.
No, it doesn't remove anything. It's
Okay.
just adding.
it's slightly changed something, if I remember correctly, when you have a fragment and then you have it's a cell with nothing. Instead of being in a separate slide, the cell with nothing come with the fragment.
Okay, so it fixes an ambiguity, but it doesn't remove a feature of reveal.
No, it's just slightly switch where the delimitation is when you have fragments.
Okay, then fine. I mean, if it's closing an ambiguity, in terms of action item on, let's just basically clarify how much breakage it introduces, and if it's nothing, let's merge it. Since Damien.
Question is also.
I'm just typing a comment.
Okay, good.
It's already posted.
43. No, that was the one it referred to. 6015.
So it's just, do we agree on adding one event on the dashboard page to be able to have people have custom JS triggering things only on the dashboard?
I'm going to leave that to you guys. That's too much JavaScript for me.
Yeah, that just makes the dashboard page more similar to the notebook page. That seems fine. It doesn't add any code. It just adds an event that fires when basically IPython is done setting up. It's very straightforward.
Makes sense. Yeah. Should
So
we have some code that does this?
What?
Should we change some of our code to use this new event?
No.
Okay.
We don't do stuff on this event. It's a we don't do stuff on the notebook event either. It's just I'm done.
Okay.
It's expressly for extensions.
Yeah, it's for most extensions want to run after everything is loaded.
Right.
And so it's just signaling, all right, IPython is done setting up the page. Now, if you wanted to wait for that, now's the time.
Okay.
All right, I merged that one.
Okay.
5639, preprocessor to execute notebooks.
I think
Just someone who should rebase it and resubmit the pull request, because Julia Evans is busy, I think.
The button's there. It doesn't appear to need a rebase.
Oh, there has been maybe just a
failed.
failure.
The test failed.
Yeah, the test failed, but that
failures. So.
Yeah, it's like real failures. I think.
Who knows about this? Min, you've been.
Yeah, I can if I'll look at it and see if the test failures are real. I think they are, and they're small, so I can just reopen and.
Okay, I've assigned that to you.
Easy enough.
5803, we said that someone had to test on Windows and some other environment and maybe submit upstream to CodeMirror. Should we assign someone?
Do we have? Has anyone tested this on non-OS 10 on Linux and Macs?
Paul, this is stuff that you care about.
I think I tested this
On Linux only, or Linux and Windows?
On Linux only so far. Yeah.
Okay. We have Windows VMs floating around, right?
Yeah, I've got one. Ben's got several.
Yeah,
I got Windows.
Yeah. Okay, so it's just waiting for a Windows double check to make sure it makes sense. Is that it?
Does anyone have any concerns with the PR otherwise?
There was something about, do we want to take it upstream to CodeMirror, or some changes upstream to CodeMirror? Matthias, that was your comment.
But I think
once I'm done with my PhD, I'm happy to do it. Once CodeMirror 4 is in IPython, but right now I would prefer.
Yeah, making sure just making sure this doesn't do something weird on Windows, I think, is all we need to do to merge it.
Okay. The PR itself is tiny, so I guess we might as well, once we test sanity of behavior on Windows, on all three OSs, and maybe because this is related to key handling, I would recommend that we test at least more than one browser, so that we include testing of Chrome and Firefox, just in case. But once that's done, I guess let's just do it. Do it here, and Matthias, you can put that on your to-do to upstream for later on. But there's no need to hold back. It's tiny. I mean, it's 3 lines of actual code. 5929.
That's allowing. Yeah.
Oh, this one I liked, but Brian wanted to talk about it. I don't know why.
Any iterable is. So if you've got a list trait, allowing any iterable means you don't get errors on things like if you assign it to a single string instead of a list of strings. It's
each character becomes an item, right?
Yeah, and that should raise.
Oh, it should.
Yeah, that's if you pass it a list, you've made a mistake, and it will behave in undefined behavior. I don't know. I would be inclined.
That's a special case that many libraries and many things have to disambiguate against. I know matplotlib actually has some utilities precisely for that, because there are cases where you really want to, where you want to exclude the fact that a string is an iterable from, you want to treat a string as a scalar kind of thing, in the sense that if it's only a string, the author made a mistake and they meant a list with just one string in it or something like that.
Yes, in fact, in just about any case where you're testing, is this thing an iterable, then the right answer, if it's a string, is usually no. Exactly.
So what I would suggest is actually...
and if it's a dict, the answer is no as well. Basically, there's a problem that it's a little too strict, that like this will reject a tuple. But I don't think this should reject any. I think this should reject anything other than a list or tuple.
Because it's also important to keep one thing in mind. Iterables in Python can be infinite. You can have an iterable which is not finite, right? Which is not a finite collection of choices.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think too many people are going to pass, itertools.count to a select widget. But yeah, I'm hard pressed to find someone.
You never know, but Control-C should sort it out. And there are plenty of easier ways to lock up your computer.
Yeah, no, the question is really, what are we trying to accept? And what we're trying to say is, we're trying to accept more than a list, but we're trying to accept a collection of values is what we're trying to accept.
Yeah, and I can't imagine, because what does an enum trait do? But what does an enum traitlet actually? Because I don't think it makes it a type. Is it a tuple or a set or something?
I'm just looking up.
So it seems like we do want a whitelist, but the whitelist should be a little bit larger than list. But the whitelist shouldn't be any iterable. Because any iterable in Python is a little bit too big. So let's grow the whitelist.
Okay, sounds like someone is typing.
Yeah, sorry, that's me. Yeah, I'm summarizing. You can move on.
You're in your keyboards.
Okay.
Okay, 5995, remove backwards compat container. Matthias.
It's just that I came across in JavaScript to something that said fix me, remove me for 3.0, so I removed it and didn't have any feedback.
Oh, okay. And did it cause any problems?
It's just
something for third-party code, I think. It's so that when you display JavaScript, it can refer to the container variable.
Okay. So this is an API. This was announced to be removed some time ago, and so the only thing, this PR is then missing something, which is it's missing a note in the documentation saying we did what we promised we would do, because we want.
Did we actually promise that
and
we
by
would
promise
do it, or
we
was
mean
it,
we made a comment in our own code.
yes, was it one of these things where we just had the idea that we would and then didn't actually tell anyone?
Yes.
That's because it isn't needed anymore, because you used to have to call container show, and now as soon as the element is
just add one line in the doc saying this got removed. It doesn't hurt. Just add one line in the docs. It's better to say it than not to say it. You never know somebody's using it. Just add one line in the code and be done. And merge it. Add one line of this got done in the API backwards incompatible API changes.
Yeah, you just have to add a what's new PR incompat dash something file.
Yeah,
okay, 6005 right arrow key movement.
Okay.
Does Paul or Matthias maybe want to?
Yep. Oh, sorry, I'm writing.
Oh, Joy.
Yeah.
This is specific to the Qt console, though. Specific to the Qt.
Oh, right, Qt console,
Yes.
not.
I haven't tried it. I just saw that nobody commented, so I say it seems simple enough.
Yeah, and I think nobody commented here, but the bug's been around for a while.
Yeah, the bug's been around for a
has?
while, and I think I chatted with him on HipChat a bit.
Okay.
So I can double check that it doesn't obviously break anything. I'm inclined, or at least the way I've been treating it for the last while is kind of letting users guide the Qt console.
Yeah.
But being fairly make sure it's not horribly broken, and then let the users decide where Qt console goes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my bar for merging Qt console PRs is lower than the rest.
And is this, I'm just putting a milestone on it, is this one we should backport to?
Probably, yeah. It's tiny. I don't see a
It's
reason
tiny.
not to.
And if it fixes something, might as well.
Yeah.
Okay, great. 5859, page up and page down functionality to the autocomplete drop down. This is a notebook thing.
Oh, sure. This looks.
Yeah, and there is one question the person didn't answer. Like behavior of autocomplete drop-down menu in different editors are slightly different. What is the behavior you want to copy? So do we have one editor we really want to get close to, or do we do things on our own?
I mean, I think your question is valid. I don't have in mind exactly one model that I say is awesome or one that I say is horrible. I do think that having page up and page down is pretty much a good idea.
Okay. I just want to make sure it doesn't conflict too much with John's work.
It makes navigation quicker.
I don't think it will conflict.
Wait,
This is in the middle.
I object to the implementation detail.
Yeah.
In that it makes it impossible to unbind this, and this is something that so this is something that I think maybe needs to be refactored further. This is one thing I didn't tackle for the keyboard refactor in 2.0 is that completion, like tab completion stayed as tab completion. I didn't mess with that, and that's kind of like hard-coded. And this adds another thing that is, one, hard-coded, so you can't change it, and two, you can't use page up and page down for other things anymore because of this.
Just to clarify, is that you can't use it when the completer's up, or you can't use it at all?
You can't. Well, yeah. In this case, I think it's when the completer is up.
Okay. Yeah, because if you can't use it at all, then that's definitely not okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But I'm less concerned about page up and page down scrolling the page when there's a completer drawn.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, can you imagine any other sensible behavior when the little completer pop-up is up? Do we really want people to like be able to rebind the whole keyboard just within the navigation of that little control widget?
No, I'm sorry. So I just mean that does it
you want to bind J to down and K to up, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. No. Does it make sense to also refactor or let me not ask a question. Let me make a statement. I think it makes sense to, whether or not this functionality goes in, just to keep in mind that this should be refactored in a way that's customizable. That is
yes, and we will use code mirror completion completely. I have a closed PR where I did that. So basically, the whole completion at some point in the future will be completely redone, and this will be thrown away.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so there's a very good chance that this code won't make it into IPython 3 because most of the completer UI will be gone. Because and just like we try not to exert ourselves too much on the input area, because it's just like, that's code mirror. To be different, you customize code mirror, you tell code mirror to do things. We want to entrust code mirror with as much as possible, because they've thought more about making an editor than we have. And code mirror has completion, and Matthias's PR that I think needs to wait for code mirror 4, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so once you have code mirror 4,
4.0 to redo the completion stuff, but
yeah, we might get to it. It depends on timeline of things.
When
but
it's 3.0, yes.
But yeah, so that will remove most of the UI code related to the completer from IPython, and then it'll be, I think, if code mirror doesn't do page down in the completer, in terms of the question of what editor do you want to match, the editor we want to match is code mirror.
Code mirror. Yeah,
so with that horizon. And given that this is such a simple patch that the user who make this contribution, water crossing, could keep it to themselves if they want to.
Pretty easily. Because of that,
do we even want to merge it, or just simply tell this person, look, thanks a bunch. This is on its way to a big refactor and cleanup. Because
my inclination is to let it. My inclination is, since it's small and isolated, my inclination is actually to let it in.
Okay.
And then also revisit what happens in the knowing that a lot of this is going to change, because there's no cost to having it in there, I think.
There's always kind of cleanup costs to any code, and so what I'm asking is how much.
This is adding one elif statement to.
Later.
Right. It's not.
Code-wise, it's back to sort of not breaking user experience. So once people start to get used to having page up and page down, we should make sure that works when we have the refactor. So the only comment I just left on here is just, can you add a test for this? And so that regardless of the implementation details, we preserve page up and page down working.
Yes, very true. Now, is that testable? Is that testable?
JavaScript is testable, yeah.
Now, okay. Yeah.
All right. The test is horrible, but it is testable.
Oh well.
But won't all of these tests, once we move to the code mirror completions, well, actually, won't we probably get rid of all of these things once we move to the code mirror completions, because it will be part of code mirror and we don't test code mirror.
This will be we don't test code mirror for, like, does code mirror work, but we can certainly issue events and verify that things change on the page according to the events that we trigger.
But I mean, once we move to CodeMirror completions, this will be internal details of how CodeMirror works. So
well, if
I would
page up and page down doesn't work in CodeMirror, then we should make it work this way. Is what
So
I'm saying.
page up and page down do work in CodeMirror.
Okay.
Okay.
Then in that case, I think
never mind.
Paul's suggestion makes sense. Well, no. But I think Paul's suggestion of saying, let's have a test for the functionality that the user, let's have a test for the user experience makes sense, because if CodeMirror preserves the user experience, then we're okay. But that way, we're checking that the user experience we want to present to our users is validated. In case, I don't know, a bug shows up in CodeMirror, maybe we catch it because our endpoint cases catch it. Our endpoint tests catch it. And I think that's a sensible thing to have, which is a test of the end user experience, if not a test of the internal implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Great.
That's it. We're done.
59:51. Brian is about to come back, and I have to leave in like 3 minutes. I have another set of meetings, so I have to leave pretty much right now. So let's knock out. Thomas, this is you.
Yes. 59:51 is my refactoring of the kernel classes so that there is what's currently called kernel base, that people, if you want to write an Octave kernel or an SQLite kernel or something like that, where it doesn't make sense to write the kernel in that language, but you can do it with a Python kernel layer that controls the whatever you're trying to talk to. Then you can subclass kernel base and just override a few relevant bits to say, what the kernel is and how it executes code and whatever. I think the only real question is the naming of the things, because that's relevant for config files, because there's configurables in some of these. The class is currently the class in IPython master is called kernel, which has both the kernel implementation and our how to execute code from that. I've split that currently into kernel and kernel base. In fact, all of the configurable things on it have ended up on kernel base, but the existing config will still work because you can apply config to a subclass and that works. We could alternatively call them something like IPython kernel and kernel.
So, Thomas, let me interrupt because I have to run. So let me drop a comment by interrupting. Sorry, and you guys can continue the conversation. Yeah. There's one thing that I would like to see as part of this PR. I really like the general idea, and I know we've talked about it. Is to have a small example. So having a script, a simple script that would implement a toy kernel that does, I don't know, every command you pass through it echoes it.
It's there.
It's in the
PR.
It's in the. I'm looking at which files were added.
It's in the documentation file.
Doc source development wrapper kernels.
Wrapper kernels. Let me see how much.
There's a section headed.
Okay,
example.
echo kernel. Yeah, I see echo kernel. All right. Yeah, that may be good enough. Yeah, okay. That's probably good enough. Okay.
Yeah, so the general...
Right, see you guys later.
Yeah, see ya.
Bye, Fernando.
Yeah, the general point that Thomas made in the hackpad is because class names are part of our config API, having names like base, we should avoid having names like base for the incomplete base classes if they're configurable, I think. Or we should at least think carefully about it. Because that means that, in our config file, there will be a section that's like kernel base, when really everything that's a kernel inherits from this. Not everything that's a base kernel, it's everything that's a kernel. So if it inherits from this, it is a kernel. So it makes sense for kernel config to affect every kernel.
Every kernel written in Python subclassing this.
Yeah.
But, yeah, there's no practical way that we can extend it
Couldn't
beyond
you
that.
have kernel-based init methods check the config file to see there is no kernel-based config attribute, and raise if there is?
No,
Or
but see,
something
that's
like
the kernel base. Kernel base is saying there should be kernel base config. Naming the class kernel base is saying you should configure kernels by saying kernel base.configurable trait equals foo.
And the way that the refactoring has panned out, all of the configurable traitlets are on kernel base.
Yeah, it is less significant in this particular case because all of the configurables, 2 of those probably shouldn't be there at all, but they're all semi-private configurables. They're like debugging configurables for debugging the kernel that pretty much nobody would ever set. But just as a general principle, when creating base classes, I think they should have the most basic name rather than the most basic name plus base. And this is a negative consequence of the design of our config system. It's obviously not. No, it's the fact that I don't know. And does that make sense? Do people disagree that? Do people think this should be called kernel base or base kernel, or because that's a common convention for incomplete base classes is that it's clear in the name.
Base.
It's clear in the name, but there's a negative consequence of that in the, or at least I think there's a negative consequence of that in the config system.
Kernel base can't be instantiated directly. You have to subclass it.
Right, but kernel manager can't be instantiated. Kernel manager, the class named kernel manager, is also incomplete. So calling calling this base kernel base and calling kernel manager is an internal inconsistency.
I hadn't even realized that kernel manager was incomplete. I thought you could instantiate a kernel manager.
Yeah, I see. If it were me, I would name it a really big, long kernel manager base. Just
yeah,
so
but then that would mean if you tried to configure kernel manager,
yeah, it would be annoying.
You wouldn't be. It's impossible to configure kernel manager because there's nothing called kernel manager.
Yeah.
You'd have to change any kernel manager config to kernel manager base config.
Yeah.
So it's and basically the question is I named the class because of config, and Thomas is naming the class because of code. What?
What subclass is kernel manager?
All the kernel managers.
Blocking kernel.
Qt blocking kernel manager, IO loop kernel manager, multi-kernel manager.
I thought, well, multi-kernel manager I thought was a separate thing, and isn't it blocking kernel client?
That inherits from kernel client, also an incomplete base class.
Oh, so there's blocking kernel manager and blocking kernel client.
Actually, I don't think there's a blocking kernel manager. I'm not sure. That may have gone away.
That went away.
There may just be blocking kernel client. I don't remember, but we never instantiate the base kernel manager and or kernel client. We use IO loop and blocking and stuff. Maybe kernel manager is complete and kernel client is incomplete. I don't remember exactly, but basically, I specifically avoid using base in the name of configurable base classes, especially ones that have existed for a while, because so this one doesn't break anything because it leaves the subclass as having the basic name. But now, like if you create your echo kernel and you inherit from kernel base, any config you have on kernel will not affect any config you have on other kernels, because kernel is not the base.
Is that a problem?
It's specifically the IPython kernel. I think it's not intuitive. I think it's the wrong behavior.
Mm.
The fact that kernel, then kernel should be renamed Python kernel.
Okay, then you're going to break all kernel config, because then there will be nothing called kernel.
Oh, you just make a shim class that is still named kernel.
Yeah, you put
everything
in a deprecation like we've done for other renames, but in the long term, you're saying nothing should be called kernel. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Then when you configure kernel base, you know you're configuring every kernel, which is wrong, because you never want to configure all the subclass of something, except when you really know what you're doing.
But
well, that's not true. I mean, configuring interactive shell makes sense when you want to configure IPython, no matter what context you're running. Configuring the base class makes sense a lot of the time. Configuring kernel manager makes sense, right? So right now, the config that people use to launch the Julia kernel and everything configures the base class, not the class that's actually instantiated.
But it won't be like that anymore once we have all the kernels.
But the things that are configurable on kernel base are things like, the polling interval for the kernel event loop.
Yeah, it doesn't matter that much for this particular case, because kernel base doesn't have much. But I don't think. But I think the point applies to everything. It sounds like you guys disagree that a configurable base class should not have the basic name. It should have. There should be nothing. There should be nothing ever called kernel manager. There should be nothing ever called kernel. There should be nothing ever called kernel client. It should all be kernel client base and IPython, and so there's always base and qualifier. There's never generic.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. I think the original way makes more sense, because you have a lot more users specifying this than you have developers writing new implementations of these things. So calling it kernel manager makes more sense than calling kernel manager base, because the kernel manager base, that name is for somebody trying to implement a kernel manager, right? And the number of people, if we confuse those people,
that's a good point.
I'm more confusing the 5 developers that are ever going to look at that part of the code than I am forcing the hundreds of users that will be using this in the config system, forcing them to understand our OOP design and why you would call something a base.
Yeah, and then if you want to configure something more specific, then you use a longer name of the subclass.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's.
But for Thomas's kernel base, like he said, that won't be configured. So do we want to stick with the object-oriented design?
I think if we think that the base class having the root name rather than the root name plus a base qualifier, I think that would apply to everything we do, even this one, even though configuring even though this is not a case that has significant practical implications, it should still be consistent.
Just for consistency?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know.
And and all it takes is a doc string and then that, right, to say that this is the base or whatever. Not have base in the name, but have it in the docs for that class. All right, I gotta run.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I will run too soon.
I have
So before everybody goes, is there a consensus on? Are we calling it IPython kernel and kernel base?
I would say IPython kernel and kernel.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't. Yeah. That's.
Can anybody hang around for a minute?
Yeah.
I have one more question.
All right,
yeah. So
bye.
that's. I don't know.
See you, Paul.
It sounds like. Oh, Matthias is gone. I don't know, does that seem icky to you, Thomas?
IPython kernel and kernel? No.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a slight preference for names that make it apparent that this is a thing that should be subclassed rather than instantiated directly, but it's a slight preference.
Okay. Okay, then. Yeah, I don't like forcing my opinion on. Well, I do it, but it doesn't mean I like it.
Don't decide the tie.
Yeah, and Paul seemed inclined toward kernel and IPython kernel.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, kernel and IPython kernel.
I also like, IPython kernel seems clearer than kernel to me. I was just calling it that because that was what it was already called.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds good. That sounds good to me. And then anybody doing similar refactors of configurable classes, keep the fact that keep the fact that the class name is actually a public API. As horrible, as gross as that is, keep the fact that the class name is a public API in the config system.
Oh, speaking of public API, that does. If we rename kernel to IPython kernel, that does break the actual API rather than the config API, because if anybody wants to import kernel, do something with it, should we just handle that by defining an alias at the bottom of the file? Kernel equals IPython kernel.
So from IPython.kernel import kernel as kernel base. IPython.kernel.ipkernel equals IPython kernel.
Something like that, yes.
Actually, make kernel a subclass of IPython kernel, so you get a deprecation warning.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't do that if you just do kernel equals IPython kernel. You'll never know that it's wrong until we remove the shim. If you make a subclass, you can get a warning.
Yeah, and we think that's sufficiently. That's worth doing. I mean,
I think so, because I think most people in going forward, people should be subclassing kernel, not IPython kernel. Yeah. This PR. One of the points of this PR is that you don't really want to subclass the IPython kernel. You want to subclass a more basic. You don't want to reuse all the IPython crap. You just want to reuse the messaging, and event stuff. Which is a more significant change. Anyway.
All right.
Okay. So that's the end of the agenda. I guess I didn't mention Notebook MB Format 4 is mostly implemented. That's what I've been working on. We need to do some discussion of how we want to handle the transition, but it's basically working. I've got almost all of the NB convert tests passing with the new NB format.
Nice. Did you make a decision, or did anybody else reply about the raising or warning question?
No, I don't think anybody's replied on that. We can talk about it. I think as I write tests and things, it keeps pointing more toward warning, or maybe even actually not validating in the conversion function itself, but validating
when you open it.
Validating explicitly whenever we in code do conversion. Because validating in conversion meant I couldn't test that the conversion makes a valid thing because it validates inside the function and it just dies.
Yeah.
Yeah, so right now it warns and I might even remove it. But it's still a discussion worth having.
So before we go, I just wanted to post these two links. Brian prefers the first one. The second one, I think, is what we talked about today, and is what I implemented originally. But it wouldn't be hard for me to roll back to the second link that I posted there. Which
one's the second? Is D?
So it's the D.
Where are these links? Are they? Oh, in here.
Yeah. So one of them is like an explicit, still passing these giant things around where I'm actually creating the dicks on the spot, and then I have one common options that I merge in. And then the other one just builds on that common options and passes that around. So that's like a master instance.
Oh, so you're passing two dictionaries?
No, it's always one dictionary.
Oh,
always
it's the $.extend. I was missing
Yeah.
that. I saw the comma and I thought it was 2 dictionaries. It's extend.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just a matter of preference. And I just wanted some extra opinions. Like I said, Brian likes that first link, which is the $.extend one. And then I think what we talked about today is the second one.
Yeah, it's not complicated. That seems okay. So at least you're explicit in main about what's getting passed around. And I mean, I called it options. That's maybe that, as Fernando pointed out, that's not the best choice.
Mm-hmm. Maybe like keywords.
If you want to really prove that we're Python programmers writing JavaScript, you call it keyword.
PWArgs.
That's
star underscore star underscore.
Yeah, right. The word
args.
star KWArgs. I think that's what we should call it.
Nice.
I don't know. I mean, I guess params is the logical.
Params?
Params is the JS convention, I think.
Yeah.
jQuery has this all over the place. I think they call it params. Arguments is a reserved word.
For the function call, right? And another thing that he wanted me to do, which you guys may or may not agree with, is in the classes that I pass this dict into, I store the parameters individually, and then later when I'm creating instances within those instances,
you build another one?
I build another one that's explicit what needs to be passed into the.
I think that's okay. It makes it clear what you're actually using.
Yeah, and I thought, like, I mean, about the argument earlier, I think it will help a little bit when we're down the line later and we are rethinking this. At least we'll know.
It'll be easier to see which things are depending on the global, because it'll be in the constructor. You know, there'll be this dot events. All right, this is an object that needs a handle on events.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fine.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah, that's my only question. So you guys like that? So that's good. That means I don't have to do any more work. I'm tired of like iterating over the entire JavaScript code base like 4 or 5 times. Just an update on it. There's like four failing JS tests now on my machine locally, and I have to look over the cell toolbars, and that's it on my to-do list.
Yeah, cell toolbars are another one of those things where the programming model is different from everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think they're not loading at all right now as is. So I just have to get them to work. I'm not sure I'll even require them. Like we'll see. We'll see how that works.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye, Internet.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Internet. See you next week.